Good evening, everyone. I welcome each one of you to today's interactive session organized by IPTSE. The Intellectual Property Talent Search Exam is the first of its kind IP Olympiad, which focuses on seeking out and nurturing young talented minds in the field of intellectual property. I, Saundarya Rathod, All India Rank 2 of the third edition as research scholar IPTSC and as a beneficiary of this exam, takes great pleasure at welcoming our guest today to another initiative by the IPTSC Academy. On behalf of the team, let me quickly introduce our guest, Mr. Dinesh Thakur and Dr. Sheetal Chopra. Dr. Chopra is the course director at IPTSC. She is also a resource person, Kapila, Ministry of Education, and also wears the hat of Mentor of Change, Niti Aayog's Atal Innovation Mission, Government of India. Today, she is representing IPTSC and she will be interviewing Mr. Dinesh Thakur. Dinesh S. Thakur is a public health activist, also known worldwide for his efforts in unraveling the wrongdoings of a pharma company. He has been a celebrated expert and entrepreneur in the field of pharmaceuticals, drug regulation, biomedical product development, and information technology. Mr. Dinesh Thakur was the director and global head research, information, and portfolio management at an Indian pharma company. He was also responsible for managing research and development information for generic drug development, manufacturing, and commercial operations. During his employment there, he discovered that the company was involved in falsification of drug data to receive approval of its generic drugs and violating current good manufacturing practices and good laboratory practices. He reported his findings to the company and subsequently resigned from his position in 2005. He continued working with the FDA and other authorities in the investigation of this fraud of falsified records and dangerous manufacturing process. For his efforts, he was recognized with the Joe A. Callaway Award for Civic Courage in 2014 and is the recipient of the ACFE's Cliff Robertson Sentinel Award. He was also named Whistleblower of the Year by Taxpayers Against Fraud in 2013. Currently, he is focusing on improving health policies of the USA and India. It's an honor interacting with you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saundarya.
Dr. Sheetal, I request you to take over from you.
Yeah, thanks so much. And Dinesh, welcome you to this platform. And as Saundarya mentioned, this is a weekly interview that is hosted. And we invite several personalities who have got a lot of experience in different domains. So we are very happy that you accepted this invite.
Oh, thank you. No, this is a good opportunity to interact with young people. So I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you. And I think considering the current environment in the country and also globally, we thought this could be the best way to interact with you and get some more details into, how this entire drug process, the regulation and everything happens. So I've got some questions for you, which I've been able to get from some people around. So allow me to ask you questions one by one.
Sure.
And you can be as elaborate as you wish to, depending on, whatever is the best for the audience to hear. So the first question, Dinesh, is you've been a senior executive with both leading American pharma company, which is BMS, Bristol Myers Squibb, and an Indian generic company, Ranbaxy. What difference did you find in the working environment and the styles between the two organizations, one being, the multinational and the other being the Indian one?
Yeah. So, okay. So I'm assuming that most of your audience is essentially, young people who either are students of intellectual property or professionals who work in the space. So I'm going to limit my conversation specifically to that specific area, so that we can have a much more meaningful discussion here. And my request is that those in the audience, feel free to ask questions, because it's not supposed to be a monologue. We can go back and forth. So you asked me a question: how does the work of a innovative pharma company differ from that what we have in India, right? So that's the question. So there are two dimensions here, right? One is a business model. The second is the process, right? So think about, the business model of a company that invests in developing new therapies, right? they have to find either a chemical entity or a biological entity that has some therapeutic value in a disease area that you're interested in. You have to develop it. You have to establish its safety and efficacy, and then get an approval from a regulator to market that drug, right? So that is the business model of an innovative pharma. And typically what happens is that now, if you study the number of drugs that are available in the market, you will get a wide range, right? You'll get somewhere between, say, 6 years on the lower end to about 14 years on the higher end. Just like anything else in the world, it's a bell curve. Things fall anywhere in between there. But that's how long it takes for a pharma company to develop and market a new therapy for a specific indication. Now we can break that down. We can try and figure out, okay, what does that six years really consist of? But before we do that, let's look at what happens with a generic pharmaceutical company, right? So the business model here is that once the drug or the active moiety goes off patent, you are trying to essentially manufacture it, right? So your focus is to develop a formulation, meaning how do you administer it, whether it's a capsule, a tablet, an injectable, a patch, anything of that nature, right? How do you get the drug to the patient? And you're trying to get it manufactured, right? That is your entire focus. You're not so much worried about the safety of that particular chemical entity or biological entity, because that's been proven already. The drug has been on the market for a number of years. There is enough clinical data to show that the drug actually works the way it's intended to. And so the focus is very different here, right? You're trying to get it to a patient in a formulation that actually works in the way. So your business model is going to be very different. So you're developing a formulation and you're actually selling it to the market. So that is the difference between the business models of a large pharma, which is an innovative pharma, and a generic drug pharma, which is what we normally have in India. Our focus has always been, until very recently, generic drug development. So that's the business model. Now let's look at it from a process point of view, because this is going to be interesting for you, the students of intellectual property, right? When you're developing a new drug, there is innovation involved, right? So either you're looking at a new chemical or a biological entity, and you're trying to look at the structure of that particular entity. So this is the product patent, right? And you're trying to figure out how to make that, right? So how do you make it, so making it in a lab in a very small quantity is very different than when you make it in kilogram quantities or ton quantities, which is required when you have a commercial product, right? So that is a process patent. So when you look at, from a patent point of view, intellectual property point of view, how do you develop, intellectual property and register your innovation around the product that you're developing, the process by which you're making? Those are essentially the process-oriented aspects of this. And typically the way it works is that the earlier part of the research, which is called the discovery research, this is typically funded by public money. Even in this country, the United States, the initial part of drug discovery is largely funded by the National Institutes of Health. And that research actually happens at universities. Once you get to a point where there is a viable drug molecule, that's where large pharma comes in. They license the drug or buy it and develop it, right? Now, I'm talking in generalities. Have there been discoveries made in large pharma? Yes, there have been. There's no question about that. But by and large, early discovery is funded by public money, and then it's licensed to a large pharma that specializes primarily in developing that drug, right? How do you develop the drug? You conduct clinical trials. Why do you conduct clinical trials? Because if you understand anything about how evidence works, you have to have a really large statistical sample to try and prove that the mechanism of that particular drug, meaning whether it's a chemical entity or a biological entity, you have to prove that statistically it's above a baseline, right? So I can, for example, take honey and shahad for sore throat, because that's kind of the Gharelu Nuska that we have in India. But in order to market that, in order to get somebody to pay money for it, you have to provide evidence that particular combination actually is therapeutic to your throat, right? That is what the regulatory requirements are going to be. So to prove that, you'll have to conduct what are called clinical studies, and that's the reason why it takes a long time to develop all of these things. Just a simple example, since we're all talking about vaccines and COVID-19 right now. How many of you know that the actual technology that's currently used within the mRNA vaccines today, the messenger RNA vaccines, this was original research funded by the National Institutes of Health in 1990. So we had this professor, Caitlin Carrico, who was at the University of Wisconsin. She was the one who sort of initially looked at how to use RNA to try and get a signal to the cell to be able to produce certain proteins. So think about this, 1990, right? Almost 30 years ago is when the research started. So they were essentially two professors, one at the University of Wisconsin, Caitlin Carrico, and then Dave Weissman at University of Pennsylvania in 1995. They're the ones who started looking at the messenger RNA as a potential druggable, sort of therapeutic candidate, and trying to figure out how do you get a message to the cell to be able to sort of produce the kind of protein that you want, right? So it takes a long time. If the initial research was funded in 1990, and the fact that when we had this pandemic, that knowledge, that research, that understanding, right, was able to be sort of used into producing the mRNA vaccines in a very, very short period of time, right? So when the pandemic broke in last year, in February, Pfizer started the clinical trials for this particular vaccine in July. Look, within like few months, you got to a point where you were evaluating whether the vaccine would actually work in humans. We only look at how quickly Pfizer was able to get into clinic, but we don't think about all the amount of work that went in from 1990 all the way to 2021, and all the knowledge that we accumulated over a period of time that allowed us to be able to build, to be able to sort of build this vaccine and get it into the clinic as quickly as possible. So let me just stop there, because this is such a wide, sort of area. Those are the two issues there, right? So you're looking at the business model of the companies and also the process by which you develop a therapeutic candidate, get it evaluated for safety and efficacy, and get it to the market.
Right. I mean, what you mentioned is so comprehensive. It just shows it's coming out of your own DNA, because you've spent such huge number of years with the pharma company. It's like
Right.
you have touched upon every part and parcel of the entire drug discovery process. So I think it's very good. There is one question, Dinesh. Of course, we've got a lot
Sure.
of questions, and I was
Sure.
so happy to hear. We had this myth. I was about to ask you this question, that
Sure.
for a drug discovery, it takes so many years. And how come
Yeah.
for a COVID, it just took 1 year? But that's not true. It's actually 1990 research, which has been capitalized
That's right.
now.
Correct.
Yeah. So there is a question from Harish in the live chat box. He's asking, who decides the quantum and the proportion of funding from National Institute of Health, NIH?
It's a very good question.
And
Very good
and
question.
how much? Yeah, and how much say the individual companies have that part in the process?
Very good question. So the way the NIH works, because remember, this is all US taxpayer money, right? The National Institutes of Health, their budget comes from what the US taxpayer pays. So the way that they do it is they have a grant making process. So what happens is that, there's a process by which anybody, whether you work at a public institution like a university, or whether you work for a private company, you can write up a grant application and describe your concept, your hypothesis in that grant application, right? What is it that you're wanting to study? And you apply to that. And the NIH is a reasonably robust process where they evaluate, the kind of research that they fund. And because, this institution has a very, very long history, they have a wide portfolio, meaning that they fund sometimes early phase research, like the kind of research that they funded with mRNA back in 1990, right? We had very little understanding of what biological molecules would do back in 1990, right? The entire biologics and biosimilars is a more recent phenomenon. This is early phase research, but they also fund, late stage research where, they look at their NIH funds clinical studies, right? So if it is a public interest, they look at that. There is a process. If you go to the NIH.gov website, they describe the process very clearly. To the question as to how much they fund and what kind of causes they fund, that's also listed there. You can go and evaluate the different kinds of grants, right? There are early discovery grants, there are late stage development grants. It all depends upon, what kind of area you're interested in. The most important thing that matters when NIH gives out money is how well thought through your idea is, right? Now realize when you're doing early phase research, right, when you're doing discovery research, you may not actually have a really good idea of what you want to do, right? You may describe several different hypotheses and you want to test them out and see what comes out of it. But if you're applying for a late stage grant, you better have a reasonably good understanding of the pharmacological properties of a particular drug. Or, you have to know that the drug is active, at least in the lab, right? When you do, your experiments in petri dishes and test tubes, at least you want to see some activity before, you can apply for a development grant. So it differs, from whether it's an early phase grant or a late stage development grant. It depends upon the kind of hypotheses that you want to sort of think about, and also think about, what it would take. How long would it take for you to be able to test that hypothesis out? So this is typically how the NIH grant process works.
It's quite comprehensive and looks like all the more transparent, which is
it
very
is,
important,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is one more question in the live chat box,
Sure.
but I would like to first ask a question that we wanted to
Sure.
ask, so that there is a segue into what he's asking.
Yes. Yeah.
So the question is that you've been at both executive as well position in various pharma companies, and also you've been the activist with the drug regulators. Any insight into how can the process of approval of drugs be improvised, especially the loopholes? How can they be plugged? And when it comes to India per se.
Yeah. So that was first question that I was going to qualify, which is that, what is the context? Is the context India or is the context United States? So you clarified that the context is in India, right? So think about Indian Drug Act, right? So the Drugs and Cosmetics Act that governs drug regulation in India, it's actually a pre-independence act, right? So it was written in 1940. That's even before we became independent. And think about, what kind of diseases was prevalent in those days, right? The biggest disease we had in those days were infections, right? Or, you look at tropical diseases like cholera, malaria, dysentery, diarrhea. Those are the kind of diseases that are prevalent. Today, we have lifestyle diseases. We have diabetes, we have cancer, we have aging-related diseases, Alzheimer's, right? These weren't prevalent in those days, right? Our lifestyle was very different. Our diet was very different. So when the Drugs and Cosmetics Act was written, it was written to essentially look at therapeutics that treated very simple diseases from a mechanistic point of view, right? Infection, you take antibiotics within a certain period of time, like 5 days or 7 days, you're able to sort of control that particular infection. Malaria, right? Malaria was very prevalent because we have, it's endemic to India because we have a lot of mosquitoes, and mosquitoes are the carriers of the parasite that causes malaria, right? And an anti-malarial typically works over a period of 7 to 11 days, and you actually get control over the parasite essentially spreading that pathogen within your body. Simplistic model. Think about now when you have diabetes. How long the type 2 diabetes and insulin do you need to take? It's a lifelong issue for you, right? So the complexity of the diseases has evolved, in our society. The problem that we have is that our regulation has not kept pace with, the complexity of diseases that have evolved. Our regulation was written for the disease burden of the 1930s and 1920s, and we're still stuck in there. I mean, I'll just give you a very simple example, right? All across the entire world, the person who's responsible for drug approvals, right? There's a position like the commissioner of the US FDA, or there is, the director of the UK's MHRA, right? The Medicines, Health and Regulatory Authority, which is the equivalent of the CDSTO in the UK. These positions are held by people with background in either medicine or public health, right? Because that's the kind of decision making that those regulatory agencies are required to make. Our law says that our Drug Controller General of India needs to be a pharmacist. Now imagine you're trying to develop a vaccine for a pandemic like COVID-19. The role of a pharmacist, somebody who's studied pharmaceutics, I'm not trying to put down pharmaceutics. I'm trying to give you an idea the kind of skills that are required to think about how to control a pandemic, how to think about therapeutics in a pandemic space from a public health point of view versus somebody who's a pharmacist. These are two different skill sets. But because in our law, we have written down that the Drug Controller General of India needs to be a pharmacist, that is what we have, right? So we have never updated our systems. We have never updated our law to make it consistent with the way modern science is practiced, right? So until we are able to go back and look at the drug regulation in the country, understand where the shortcomings are, bring it in line with what is current science, currently acceptable science, this is the issue that we keep running into all the time.
Right, absolutely. So that's a big bottleneck. I think that requires a restructuring now at the earliest, I would say. Yeah. So Dinesh, there is another question on live chat from Pallavi Bhatia, and apparently she's also been a research scholar with IPTSE Academy. So I'm happy that students are asking questions.
Good.
So the question is, will the waiver that we are hearing right now, almost global, it has become a global talk point.
Yes.
Is it going to be, will waiver make it possible for drugs and vaccines to be manufactured in developing countries and LDCs more specifically? Or do you really think that it's not really has anything to do with waiver, but problem really lies somewhere else?
Yeah. So there are two issues here, right? The first issue is just looking at the very short-term need that we have, which is that we don't have enough vaccines in the country, right? We have completely mismanaged our supply chain as far as vaccines is concerned, and we just don't have enough vaccines. It's a very short-term issue that we're dealing with. The longer-term issue is that, what happens to therapeutics that essentially are patented, but are important to public health. That's a longer-term issue, right? So in order to answer Pallavi's question, you have to first, define the context. Are you talking about vaccines in the context of the current pandemic, right? So let's take that issue first, and we'll talk about the longer term issue, right? Let's assume that even if the WTO actually agrees to a proposal to waive off intellectual property for this particular set of mRNA vaccines. Let's assume that happens. Do we really have the capability to scale up today and actually provide, make those vaccines in LDCs or LMICs, whatever you call them, lower and middle income countries? Do we really have the capacity? No, we do not, right? Because if you look back at all the vaccines that we have produced so far, they have either been whole viron viruses or some vector-borne, what we have done with either rotavirus, with meningitis, with rabies, with hepatitis C. That is a technology that we have used. We have never actually developed the capacity to actually build, to manufacture the messenger modified nucleoside messenger RNA vaccines in either India or any of the third world countries, right? That capacity does not exist. So unless there is technology transfer, unless there is know-how transfer from Pfizer, BioNTech, or Moderna to these countries, to the capacity, we are not going to be able to resolve the short-term issue that we are dealing with, right? Intellectual property waiver is a prerequisite. It's a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition for us to be able to address our immediate need that we have, which is that we need to vaccinate our people. Now, so that's the short-term context question. The longer-term issue is a waiver of this kind beneficial? Yes, it absolutely is. It absolutely is, right? So there is a concept of, for those students who are interested in IP law, there is this concept of what is called evergreening, right? So you take a base patent and you get an extension to the base patent by either seeking an additional indication, right? Or you're trying to get some small modification done and get the extension to the 17-year life of the patent, right? And that is filled with abuse. large pharma basically sort of uses that particular provision to continue to extend the life of the patent, right, above and beyond what is reasonable. In such cases, it is extremely important to look at it from a public interest point of view, right? Remember, go back to the first question, what we spoke about. 90% of the drug discovery is done with public money, right? So there has to be some benefit to that public money after a certain period of monopoly that IP guarantees for a therapeutic, new drug therapeutic, right? That is not something that we do today very well. So the role of waiver of intellectual property generally is very important, right? But we are talking about this right now in the context of whether it will help us with the current vaccine problem. I don't believe it will.
Right, you're absolutely right. I think it's more to do with manufacturing capabilities and the
Correct.
know-how
Correct.
as against the waiver, because we keep reading that Moderna and many other companies have actually said that we are not going to enforce our IP against anyone. So IP, I don't think is an issue, right?
That's also a messaging issue, right? They know fully well that even if they don't enforce the IP, to be able to produce the vaccine, remember, messenger RNA is very labile, right? It doesn't exist, for more than a few minutes all by itself. The real issue here is how do you coat that messenger RNA with a lipid layer that makes it stable? That technology is not something that anybody has today, right? That is the issue that we're dealing with. How do you take the messenger RNA and make it stable enough so that when you take it out of the -20 freezer, and by the time you inject that into somebody's arm, you still need that thing to be stable, right? So the way that they've gotten around that is essentially coating that messenger RNA with a lipid layer, right? That protects that. It only gets, once it gets into our muscle, it figures out how to get into the cell by breaking up the lipid layer. Remember the coronavirus, we think about this, right? The only thing that affects the coronavirus is a lipid, because why do we wash our hands? Is because soap destroys a lipid layer. So once it gets into the body, the messenger RNA needs to get inside the cell, right? That is a technology that is really, really important for these mRNA viruses to work. How do you modify the nucleoside sequence of the messenger RNA so that it doesn't generate, sort of a broad spectrum immune response? It has to be very specific to get inside the cell, right? In order for it to instruct the cell to make the protein that you want. That technology is not something that we've ever done in any of the low and middle income countries. So when Moderna says that, yes, we won't enforce our intellectual property, they know very well that even if they did not, it is without their help, we can't figure it out. In the short term. Longer term, we will, right? But in the time that we need for the next few months, we can't figure it out. So that's the problem.
Right. While I'm also mindful of the time, but I don't feel like that, it's so engaging, hearing you it's almost coming from a passionate person who has got so much of experience. But let me just take it a little bit more, maybe one more 3 minutes more. There is a very interesting question that Vishal Mehta is asking. He's from Biocon. Vishal, thank you so much that you are asking this question, and I hope it will be fine for Dinesh to respond. Sure. So what is forcing reputed US companies such as Pfizer to push the government of India for indemnity clause? And why is it that it's being, small scale trials are being avoided before getting the permission to sell their vaccines to the country?
So look, and then we can go over a little bit of time if you want. We don't have to stick to the 30 minutes. So this is a question that I think will require some insight into what is really in the indemnity bond that is being asked for, right? So I don't have that answer. But I'll tell you something generally, right? Remember, the both of these vaccines, the Pfizer BioNTech and the Moderna vaccines, were approved on an emergency use authorization to begin with, right? Which was not a full approval. It was a limited approval, right? Based on efficacy data. We didn't have effectiveness data. Now we have effectiveness data. Remember, these were approved back in December of last year. when you approve drugs or vaccines or any kind of therapeutics with a qualifier, that basically means that you don't have enough safety data or efficacy data like you normally have with a phase 3 clinical study, right? That's what an emergency use authorization means, which means that you don't have enough confidence in your benefit risk evaluation. But because it was a pandemic and because people needed to be vaccinated, they got an EUA approval. When you get an EUA approval, there is a possibility that you will see serious adverse events because you haven't had the time to properly study what the therapeutic does in the clinic, right? That is the reason we had, efficacy data at that point in time. Now Pfizer has full approval because there's enough real world data for effectiveness. So the reason indemnity became important at that point in time was because Pfizer was saying, look, we have limited amount of data based on which we believe that our vaccine is 95% effective, right? And government, US FDA, if you're going to give us an approval based on this data, you have to also understand that we don't have full set of data, what we would normally do in normal circumstances, so that we can fully qualify the safety and efficacy profile of our therapeutic, right? That is the reason why we needed to have an indemnity bond. Today, there are over 200 million patients who have been given the Pfizer vaccine, including me, right? So there is real world data to say what is the effectiveness of this particular vaccine candidate. Based on that, they've gotten a full approval right now. That is the role of the indemnity bond, right? Whenever you give a qualified approval, you're admitting that you don't have all the safety and efficacy data at that point in time, and you could see things that you may not want to see, right? You may see serious side effects when used in public population. The second question that was asked was, why is it that we don't, we're doing smaller, probably poorly designed studies, right? I think this is where our institutions become really important, right? Look, WHO did a very large solidarity trial where they evaluated multiple therapeutic options, right? It was a well-designed, well-powered study. I wish we had institutions in India that also did the same thing, right? We have ICMR, which is the guardian of science in India. We have our entire industry produces generic drugs. It would have been great if ICMR took it upon themselves last year to say, what, we are going to evaluate through a properly designed study, right? It doesn't help when we have 10-patient study. Like I was reading this morning that apparently some hospital in Bangalore wants to study the effect of radiation on treatment for COVID-19 on 10 patients. What will that do? I mean, what will studying on 10 patients do for you? See, the point here is, you can get, people, going out there and making claims that, oh, just because I've registered a clinical trial in the clinical trial, registry of India, that somehow gives me a certificate saying my trial design is valid. It's not. That's how we got Coronil, right? You can't test a study on 25 patients. You can't do an evaluation on 25 patients. And just because you've registered your study design and protocol in clinical trial registry of India doesn't make your trial good. You need to have institutions that actually evaluate a study design and say, is this a joke or is it a properly designed study? Unless we get to the point where we have that kind of rigor, unfortunately, we'll continue to have this kind of nonsense. So.
Amazing. I mean, and looks a bit scary though.
It is, but the thing is, there's a lot of lessons to learn, right?
Yeah.
I think that if nothing else, what happened over the last year, there are lots and lots of lessons we should learn and fix our systems and our processes going forward.
Correct. Right. So very interesting. I'm so happy that IPTSE Academy invited you, Dinesh. So there is another question. Can we move on? Dinesh, would you have time? A bit more?
No, that's fine. Yes. Yeah, of course.
All right. So there is a question from Ria. And she's asking, why do you think ICMR and Bharat Biotech are not sharing information about funding and clinical trials? And also, do you think our indigenously developed drug by DRDO, which is called as 2DG, will be a game changer for COVID treatment?
So two very good questions. I wish I had the data to tell you. Okay, I don't work for ICMR, and neither do I work for Bharat Biotech, right? So why are they holding back phase 3 data from publication? I think that's a question that you should ask them, right? I mean, I remember that the CEO of Bharat Biotech had said that by March we would actually see a publication on phase 3. Well, we're in May right now. Why is it taking this long for them to publish their data? I don't know. So you have to ask them. The second question that you're asking about game changer of 2DG, I wish it was. I would have loved to see a therapy that actually comes from India that is properly tested in clinic. If you look at the data that the DRDO has provided for approval of 2DG, I wouldn't even let this come near. I mean, if I was running a clinical development program in a pharma company, that wouldn't even make up my portfolio list. That's how poorly studied that drug is, right? So the question here is this, right? There's a lot of marketing, and I understand that, right? We want to say that we've developed a drug that actually helps, COVID patients. It's a good thing, but the thing is, you can't do this, in a haphazard way, right? If you're willing to call out Baba Ramdev to say Coronel has not been tested properly, you have to apply the same standard when it comes to evidence-based medicine. You cannot have two different standards, right? If you say that Coronel wasn't tested properly, the study wasn't designed properly, it wasn't done properly, right? If that is what you're willing to say when it comes to an Ayurvedic concoction, then the same standard has to be applied to the 2DG drug. Have you looked at the study design? Have you looked at how many patients it was tested in? Have you looked at the study results? Is there a statistical significance in what has been studied, right? If you believe that that is true, then you can be very happy that we have a drug for treating COVID-19. I mean, as students of science and of intellectual property, right, it becomes very important for us to think about this from a purely scientific point of view. There's always going to be a lot of marketing hype, right? There is every company that wants to sell something, will always create a marketing campaign to convince you that this is the best thing since sliced bread. I mean, I'll just give you one simple example, right? A month ago, just about a month ago this time, Twitter timeline was completely filled with people trying to find favipiravir, right? Everybody was saying, can I get a strip of favipiravir because my doctor prescribed it, right? Did you know that favipiravir never actually made to the ICMR guidelines? It was never on the ICMR guidelines for treatment of COVID-19. Now, if this drug was so good, why wasn't it on ICMR guidelines? You should ask yourself, right? And then you should also look at how much money did the manufacturer of favipiravir make. It's all reported, right? This is all public information. 700 crore rupees in the last year from the sale of favipiravir. Okay? If the drug was so good that it was not even included in our national treatment guidelines, and the manufacturer of that drug makes 700 crore rupees just in the last 8 months. I'm not talking about a longer period of time. In the last 8 months. You have to separate out fact from fiction, right? It's very important that you do that. Either you say that we don't believe what ICMR says, right? That you don't have confidence in Dr. Galeria and Dr. Paul and all the medical experts that serve on the ICMR. Or you say that we are okay with giving 700 some crores over to the pharma company that has not proven that its drug actually works in COVID-19. So that's a question we have to answer to ourselves.
I think you make a very important point, Dinesh. The question that you want us to ask anybody is maybe IP literate or a literate in pharma category may still ask. Yeah. But what about general consumer? That person doesn't know anything, right? He's just walking and talking on the prescription given by the doctor.
Very true. And that is one of the reasons why, again, we go back to the regulation, right? our Drugs and Magic Remedies Act, the government actually had brought in an amendment to the Drugs and Magic Remedies Act in the December of 2018, after the Parliamentary Standing Committee called out on it, basically saying that you cannot allow people to make claims that are not substantiated in data. But what the industry did was it went to the Delhi High Court with an army of lawyers and got that order stayed. The regulation stayed, and that's still essentially sort of buried in Delhi High Court at this point in time. So we go back to again the law, right? Do we have the regulatory system? Do we have laws in a country that force people not to make unsubstantiated claims, right? And if you don't have that law, then you can't blame people from going on TV and basically saying, "Oxygen to sabhi jagah hai, खींच लो, क्या करोगे?"
True. I think a very relevant question also spotted online by Shali, and she asked that when all this is going on, what you're mentioning about where tests are not comprehensive, and then you are now saying that children younger than 18 or 18 above are to be vaccinated. How safe are they?
So the US now is actually vaccinating children, right? With the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. There is data. So what Pfizer did was they did a clinical study in children. First, they actually did the original approval, if you remember, was it 16 and above or 18 and above? The original emergency use authorization. After that, they did the study and basically got it 12 and above, right? Now, they're doing a study to even look at, infants and adolescents as well. The question here is that yes, children are being vaccinated, but it's based on clinical data, right? You have done a study, you've studied it in children, you've seen the vaccine is safe, you've seen that the side effects are manageable. Based on that, the US FDA has given permission to Pfizer to administer its vaccine in adolescent children. So 12 and above are eligible right now in the United States. I have not seen similar data for either Covishield or Covaxin. The day that we have that data, then we can say, yes, we have done a proper study. We have looked at, how Covishield behaves in children 12 and above. And based on that, we are recommending that this is the dosage that we want to give. Until such time, I don't know what to say.
Yeah. But at least you're highlighting the issue. I think the audience that is viewing it right now, they can have their family become aware of all of this. And there is another very interesting question by Archana Shankar from Anand and Anand. And she's asked a very relevant question. In fact, this question was also in my mind. Why is government changing the interval between the two doses when it comes to Covishield? Is it scientifically proven at all? And why is it this back and forth?
Yeah, so I can't answer that question because you have to ask somebody who's changing that, right? What I can tell you is what the data shows. So with the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, Covishield, right? There is evidence that you can increase the interval between two vaccines to about 8 weeks, and that still gives you robust protection, right? But our stuff, the way that we went about doing this, first saying that it has to be 28 days, then it could be I forget now what the number was, and now it's been extended to much beyond that. I don't have any data to support the most recent iteration of the Indian government. It seems primarily to be driven by availability of the vaccine rather than any scientific study that we have seen so far.
I'm so sorry, this phone rang up. I'm extremely sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Yeah.
No, sorry. That's yeah. So I don't have data to support the extension. Yeah.
So Dinesh, there is one more question from Yuvraj, and I know that he also comes from a very extensive pharma and regulatory background. So he's asking that government could have had a mechanism to rope in innovators and incentivize them to enable them to be able to very easily transfer the know-how or whatever you may say for the implementers. What are your views? What is lacking here?
Yeah. So again, we can only go by the outcome, right? What is publicly known? What kind of decision making went into that process? Unless you're a member of the government or the government approved council, you don't know, right? So let me just give you a couple of examples, right? So the government partnered vaccine is the whole viron-based COVID Covaxin that was developed by Bharat Biotech, right? Remember what this is. This is a virus that has been inactivated, right? And that is what is going to produce immune response in our body. Whenever you're dealing with live viruses, you have to have very strong controls, right? BSL-3, biological safety and hazard level 3 facilities, right? The AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, on the other hand, it's a vector-based vaccine, right? So it's essentially taking a vehicle on which you're imbibing this particular protein to try and generate an immune response. It doesn't require the same level of controls in order to make that vaccine. Whoever it was in the government, when they decided that we are going to go the whole viron way, which is what they did with Bharat Biotech last year, they should have thought about the fact that, look, Bharat Biotech's capacity to make whole viron viruses is what? It's less than 5 crores a month, right? Well, a country like India with 130 crore people, will we be able to produce enough of it if we are investing in developing a whole viron vaccine? Number one. Number two, do they have, I mean, if you wanted to scale up, if you wanted to build capacity, right? Government has capacity in Kasauli, in what they've done with Hafkin in Mumbai and Pune at this point in time. The point here is that if they thought that maybe Bharat Biotech did not have enough BSL-3 capacity to make this kind of virus, can we look at the public sector utilities, in terms of whoever had been making viruses in the past and say, what can we do to upgrade their skills? Can we invest in bringing those facilities up to scale so that when the clinical trial is done, we can license this particular vaccine, which obviously the government of India owns partly, to all of these other companies so that they can go ahead and make that, right? It appears that that level of thinking was never actually done, right? The reason why they gave a license to Hafkin very recently, about a month and a half ago, was because they realized that they just didn't have enough planning for what we needed to inoculate 130 crore people, right? So that is the problem that we have. We can only look at what is publicly available, right? If you're asking me what was the government thinking, I don't have the ability to go and look in their mind and say, what were you thinking at that point in time? But if you look at their actions, it appears that they weren't thinking at all. If they were thinking, they would have, given, they've at least invested in building capacity in all of these public sector units way back in the fall of last year, right? Somewhere around when they were beginning to do clinical studies on Covaxin, they would have said, you know what, we know Bharat Biotech doesn't have the capacity to make this thing, right? Let's try and think about, what are the facilities exist in the country. Let's try to upgrade them. Let's try to bring them up to speed so that as soon as the clinical trial is done, we should be able to make this vaccine as quickly as possible. We just didn't do that. So
yeah, true. There is another question from Aman. Dinesh. So he's asking that your foundation had sponsored a story on an alleged breach of new drug and clinical trials rules. In this context, how important is it to enforce mandatory use of technology like smart bands for measuring oxygen saturation and also heart rate, and also maybe IoT devices?
So let me address the foundation's work, right? We don't sponsor a story. We basically we are trying to build capacity for public health-based research and reporting in the country. We don't go looking for a story or a particular topic to be able to tell people that this is the way that you want to research. We essentially fund and support researchers who then define what they want to do. So let me just set that aside clearly so that people know that there is no agenda around here. It's important for a country of our size to have enough people with a research bent to be able to look at these things critically in public interest, and that is what we are trying to do. Now, the meat of the question is that using IoT devices and things of that nature. Look, I don't know enough about that, so let me not offer unthought of an question, a response to it. Let me just say something that is broader, right? Look at the Arogya Setu app. Look at the Coven app. You are the persons who are using it, right? Are you happy with it? Technology is not a solution, right? You have to think about the process. I think we don't think about the process to begin with. And our first reaction is, where is your Aadhaar card? Right? Technology is not a solution, processes. And we need to get away from thinking about, IoT and apps and things of that nature. Look, I'm not saying they don't have a role. They very well may have a role, right? But the point here is that if you're looking at technology at the expense of looking at process, that's a wrong way to go about doing this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a simple example, right? When you think about design of the COVID app, you could have looked at it from two different points of view, right? One is that I am interested in getting a vaccine. I go to that website or the app, I register myself, meaning that I provide some information, where I live, what zip code, pin code that I live in, so that you can locate me, right? When the vaccine is available. Once that registration is done, if and when the vaccine supplies are available, you can text me, right? I don't have to sit there and keep refreshing over and over and over again, which is what is happening today, right? I can go register myself, and once the vaccine is available, or if I fall within the category of whoever you want to vaccinate, you can send me a text message and say, look, you know what? You can go to this particular place at this time, you can get yourself vaccinated. Look how much angst we would have taken out of the system. Why don't we do that? Because we don't think about the process, right? Whoever was designing this application wanted to design it in such a way that that person has to sit there and get an online appointment. What benefit is it, tell me, to essentially get people to sit on their website and keep refreshing until the appointment becomes available? Why don't we do this? We don't do this because we don't think about the process. We think technology is a solution to everything. Without understanding the process, the technology doesn't do anything for you. We have to get away from thinking about tech as a solution. How easy is it to actually, go to the website, register yourself, put your phone number in, basically say, when there is vaccine available, and if I qualify according to your your own metrics, you send me a text a day ahead and say, 10 o'clock, go to this place and you'll get yourself vaccinated. That's it. It's the same data, right? So, I mean, I don't know enough about the questions that are being asked, so I'm not going to comment on that. But I'm just saying, generally, we need to get away from technology as a solution. We need to think about the process as a solution.
So. Yeah, I think both plays a very important role, because what I could foresee as a consumer, if it is also very few shots that are now available. It's almost like first come, first serve basis.
Correct.
That's where Correct. The technology has come in place. Okay, if you are the first one to have ordered it, so you get vaccinated. So I think it's technology and process both have to go hand in hand.
Yeah, but see, when you register on the website of the COVID app, you still know who. If you register before I do, you're still first, right? Is it not? Let's assume that once the government said that anybody below 45 was available now for vaccination, and on that morning you went ahead and registered, you obviously are ahead of me, right? I don't have to sit there and keep refreshing all the time.
Yeah,
the computer can capture the time, right? The computer captures the date and timestamp of when you registered. So it's just about our thinking, in how we think about these things.
Yeah, and and situation becomes all the more complex if so many of us have picked the app at the same time. Then who gets the benefit, and hence technology. Exactly. So I think I would say that both of these are important when it comes to making it available. I'm very mindful it's 7:25 and we've almost covered a complete circle. But let me ask you one more question or two more so that we are able to then finish off in next 2-3 minutes. I'm sure audience is enjoying it as much and will be able to circulate it better at a later stage for a larger benefit. So Dinesh, another question is about the price cap. What is your view on the price cap on COVID vaccines and the treatment to enhance local production or availability or affordability of it?
Okay, so from a public health point of view, there has to be just one price for the vaccine, and that price is zero, right? I don't agree with this multi-tiered process pricing strategy that's been implemented. how the government pays for the vaccine is up to the government. It cannot be up to the individual, right? You make it publicly available, make it zero. That doesn't mean that you prohibit private institutions from charging something. If I decide that I have 1,200 rupees in my pocket and I want to go into Medanta and get it inoculated, that's my choice, right? But if I'm going to the facility that is run by the local government, state government, or the union government, the price should be zero.
Hmm.
That is my take on the pricing strategy. Now, I'm not a part of the government. I don't have any input into the way that they design the strategy, so it's easy for me to say that.
Right. I'll go ahead with asking another question then. So there is a question from Shraddha. She's an advocate, and she's asking, how is Sputnik V as effective as it's been claimed?
So there are questions around the clinical trial of Sputnik V 5 as well. If you go and look at the data and the questions the Brazilian regulator has raised related to the clinical studies of Sputnik 5, you will see that there are still some questions around. At this point in time, I would educate myself if I'm trying to take the Sputnik vaccine. I would educate myself as to what the scientific information is. We don't have enough time to go into all the details at this point, but there's enough data available in the scientific journals to be able for you to understand what the issues are. I'm not saying it's not efficacious. I'm not saying that the vaccine doesn't work, because from the data that we have right now, I think it does work, but I have to hold it to the same standards everywhere, right? So if you have questions regarding the way the clinical study was conducted, I would say that yes, I have questions about that particular vaccine, just as if I have questions about Covaxin.
Yeah. So then there is a last question, I think, but thank you so much for giving such frank opinion, and that is what helps public at large. So Dinesh, another question, and the last question from our side is that how India can generate funds from various sources, including multilateral agencies such as WHO, to manufacture these vaccines locally by Indian PSUs for mass immunization.
So look, I think that we've seen this happen with COVID Shield and COVAX, right? COVAX is it's an institution that is funded by philanthropy, and that money was given to Serum Institute $300 million, essentially to buy vaccines for low and middle income countries. So there is a model for that, to be able to do that. The question, I think, is going to be of transparency, right? So whoever is actually funding, whether procurement of vaccines or development, they have to be transparent about what they're doing, right? I mean, why they're doing it, what is in their interest. Any institution that you give money to, it has to publicly sort of disclose who all gave the money, where was the money used for, and what are the priorities of that particular institution. I mean, we talked about my foundation as well. We every research that is done, we disclose the fact that this was done by support of the foundation. So we try to be as transparent as possible. I think that's the most important thing, right? So there is a need for more investment in building capacity, because that's one thing that we have learned about the fact that we just don't have enough capacity to manufacture enough vaccines in a short period of time, right? If this was not a pandemic, this was not something that we needed right away, we could have done with whatever facilities we have right now. But the demand is so high today in the short period of time that whatever capacity exists is not sufficient to provide support to everybody that is needed. This is something that I think that it's more important for the low and middle income countries to get together and talk about it, right? Because if you look at the map of the world and look at vaccine prevalence right now, right? There are only a few countries like Western Europe and the United States that have, access to vaccines to a large, large portion of the population. India has done, some like low single digits right now. But if you look at Africa, there's barely anything. If you look at, Latin America, there's barely anything, right? So, and this is not going to be the last pandemic we have. We will have more pandemics in the future. So it is going to be important for, world bodies to come together and figure out where is it that they can build capacity? And it cannot be in one country. It has to be spread across multiple countries so that you de-risk the process, right? So that you're not held at ransom if it's in one country. You sort of de-risk the process and you invest in building that capacity because it's going to be very much needed. You can't have this kind of dichotomy that in one country you have 50% people already have vaccine, and another part of the world you have zero.
Yeah.
So that's a big issue.
Right. Thank you
All
so
right.
much, Dinesh. It's 7:30
Okay.
sharp. Thank you so
Sure.
much for joining in, and you've been very kind
welcome.
that you could allow us to extend it by another 30 minutes. Thank you so much. We'll
All
see
right.
you again.
Thank you again. Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.